Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
Sunday dinner was supposed to be background noise, the kind of routine that keeps a family pretending everything is fine, until my mother, who had been smiling in that tight way she uses when she wants an audience, pointed straight at me and said, "We cannot support you forever," and the table went quiet in that sticky way where even the clink of a fork sounds like judgment, and I felt the old familiar urge to explain myself rise up like a reflex I learned in childhood, while another part of me, the part that has paid bills in secret and kept accounts balanced when they were not even watching, told me to breathe, to keep my face neutral, and to let her finish her performance. I did not argue, because arguing has never done anything in this family except give them material for later, so I let my brother make a joke about late bloomers, and let my father pour himself another glass, and say that responsibility builds character. And I nodded through it like I was slow and grateful, while inside I counted the transfers I had made over the last few years, the scheduled payments that ran like a metronome under our household drama, the careful deposits that kept their retirement account on pace, the quiet grocery deliveries when they pretended the pantry was magically restocked, the mortgage top-offs during my father's lean months that were never acknowledged because acknowledgement would have ruined the story that I am the dependent one. What gets me most is not the money itself, and it never has been, because money is a tool and I am good with tools. What gets me is the way they call it support when it flows one direction and sacrifice when it flows the other. And how my mother managed to look me square in the eye and say we cannot carry you when I know, down to the cent, because I track everything, that I have been the one carrying them while playing along with this fiction for the sake of peace, which is a word my mother loves because it sounds noble even when it is just code for keep quiet and keep paying. I finished my salad. I thanked my mother for dinner, and I packed leftovers I did not want because refusing them would have been labeled ungrateful, and when I hugged her at the door she whispered that she believed in tough love and that one day I would thank her. And I smiled the kind of smile that has saved me from so many arguments. Then I got in my car, drove home in silence, unlocked the door, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that I did not even taste, because the only thing I could think about was how a person chooses who they are going to be the minute they decide what they will no longer allow. I opened the banking portal, and there it all was, the little river I had built out of my own work and my own missed weekends and my own passed-over trips and my own just wait a little longer dreams, flowing neatly into the account I had set up years ago when my father called me and said, "We are behind and your mother is anxious, and could you help for a little while?" And a little while turned into years because little whiles are elastic when no one wants to admit what they cost, so I clicked through the confirmations. I read the fine print I already knew by heart. I canceled the automatic contributions with the same steady hands I used to set them up, and I took a screenshot of the final screen just to mark the moment, not to threaten anyone, not to gloat, but to remind myself that I do not have to keep rescuing people who mistake my help for proof that I am weak. I did not send a message. I did not write a long explanation. I did not ask permission or permission to stop. I simply turned off the faucet, opened a new account with my own name on it and a plan that only answers to me. And when the confirmation email arrived, I archived it without ceremony, because nothing about this needed fireworks, only resolve and a kind of quiet that felt new in my chest, like space I had finally cleared. By morning, my hallway was lined with boxes that had waited too long to be packed, boxes full of the ordinary things you only notice when you choose yourself, the books I kept meaning to sell, the framed degree they said was cute but impractical, the blender I bought with a holiday bonus they told me to spend on the family, and I carried the first one out to the car with that steady pace I trust now, no rush, no panic, just decision, when the front door at my parents' house opened across town. And my mother stepped into her own mourning, still convinced that her sentence had set me straight, not yet knowing that mine had already been typed and confirmed in the quiet of my kitchen. And as I set the box down and wiped my hands on my jeans, I practiced what I would say if she showed up early or called me on speaker with my father listening, because I was done with soft answers and pretty lies, and my first move was already made. Clean and irreversible, which meant that when she did step onto the driveway and ask what on earth I thought I was doing, I would meet her eyes and, for the first time in years, Tell the truth in one line that would rearrange the entire story she had been telling about me. When I think back on the years that led to that Sunday dinner, the years where I nodded through every comment about how I needed to get my life together, the irony nearly chokes me. Because while they were building their narrative of being the selfless parents supporting their struggling daughter, I was quietly draining myself to hold up the very foundation they were standing on, and the more I gave, the less they seemed to notice. As though my contributions were invisible simply because acknowledging them would ruin the picture they preferred to keep on display. It started innocently, if you can call manipulation innocent, when my father called me one night and said they were behind on contributions to their retirement fund and my mother was losing sleep. And could I possibly take over payments for a little while until things stabilized? And I remember hesitating, not because I didn't want to help, but because I had just started making progress on my own debts, and saying yes meant shelving my goals yet again. But his voice carried that mixture of shame and entitlement that always made me fold, so I set up the automatic transfer, told myself it would be temporary, and figured a few months wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Months became a year, and a year became 3, and then 5, and by then it wasn't just the retirement account anymore, because my brother had racked up debt he couldn't handle after blowing through money on a business scheme that collapsed. And, of course, my parents called me, not him, because they knew I was the one with the steady job and the sense of responsibility, so I covered the gap just until he got back on his feet, which was the exact same phrase they had used for themselves when they pulled me into their financial mess, and I didn't fight it, because every family has a responsible one, and I had been cast in that role long before I had the language to resist it. What stings even now is the memory of my mother bragging at family gatherings about how she and my father had been disciplined savers all their lives, how they had never relied on anyone but themselves, while I sat there swallowing words I could never say. Words that would have shattered the fragile pride she clung to, words that would have revealed that without my steady direct deposits, their account would have been as empty as the promises they made to me about eventually reimbursing me when things turned around. I cut vacations out of my life, skipped dinners with friends, and watched coworkers buy homes while I stayed in a rental, telling myself patience was a virtue, even while my paycheck built their security, not mine, and the worst part is how normal it began to feel. How I almost forgot what it meant to make decisions purely for myself, because every time I thought about pulling back, guilt showed up like a shadow reminding me that if I stopped, they would sink, and if they sank, I would be the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on family. I remember one winter when I worked overtime for months, dragging myself home past midnight just to cover a shortfall in their mortgage after my father had bad luck with a side investment, and instead of saying thank you, my mother told me during Christmas dinner that I needed to stop wasting energy on trivial things and focus on finding a real career path, and I smiled with clenched teeth because nobody at that table knew I had kept the roof over their heads. Nobody knew the presents under the tree had been bought with money I freed up by skipping meals and living on instant noodles. Every sacrifice was twisted into proof that I wasn't progressing fast enough. Every favor was erased the minute it was done, and somehow I became the dependent child in their story while quietly functioning as their safety net. And it got to the point where I no longer even recognized the version of me they talked about, because she was lazy, aimless, immature, while the real me was working 2 jobs and funneling the bulk of her income into accounts that weren't even hers. When people talk about betrayal, they usually mean lies or affairs or broken promises, but for me betrayal was sitting at a table with my own family and hearing them laugh about how I wouldn't last 2 months without their help, while knowing in my bones that they wouldn't have lasted 2 months without mine. And that kind of betrayal doesn't scream. It doesn't slap you across the face. It eats away quietly, until the day something snaps and you decide to stop playing along. By the time that Sunday dinner rolled around, I had a mental ledger so full of unacknowledged sacrifices that it almost felt comical when my mother delivered her little speech about tough love. Because in that moment I realized they had no idea what love really costs, no idea how many times I had chosen their stability over my own. No idea that the only reason they could sit there and look smug was because I had been holding them up the entire time, and I decided right then that I was finished. that the story they had built was about to collapse, and they would never see it coming. And that is why, the very next morning, when I carried those boxes to my car, I wasn't just moving things around, I was preparing to move the balance of power, because what I had kept secret for years was about to come out, not in a scream, not in a fight, but in one line delivered with the kind of finality that comes only from years of carrying weight in silence, and knowing the silence is finally about to break. The next morning carried none of the weight of ceremony or drama they would have expected from me, because I didn't slam doors or announce speeches. I simply started carrying boxes from my hallway to the car in the driveway, moving with the quiet rhythm of someone who had already made up her mind. And it wasn't until my mother came outside, robe tied too tightly around her waist and suspicion written all over her face, that the moment began to swell into something bigger. Because she saw me, bent over the trunk, shoving in books and binders, and she asked in that tone she uses when she already assumes the answer, "What on earth are you doing?" as though I had to report to her like a teenager caught sneaking out. I straightened up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and for once I didn't pad the truth or dress it in politeness. I just said flatly that I had stopped funding their retirement account, and the words hung there like smoke, drifting around her until her face began to shift from annoyance to something close to fear, because she blinked at me the way you blink when your brain needs an extra second to catch up, and in that silence I realized she truly had no idea that for all those years of contributions and adjustments and late-night scrambles on my end, she had never considered where the money came from, or maybe she had convinced herself it was magic, or discipline, or fate, but never me. And now that I had said it aloud, her whole narrative cracked in front of me. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say it wasn't true, like she wanted to tell me not to exaggerate, but my father stepped out behind her, coffee mug in hand, and he caught the tail end of my sentence, and I saw it land in his face differently. Not as confusion, but as recognition, because he remembered the phone call, the first ask, the "just until we stabilize" promise that became years, and the way he went silent told me he had known all along and had chosen to treat it like background noise. Something convenient to ignore, but now the truth was out and ignoring it wasn't an option. I leaned back against the car, arms folded, and I let them stand there with the weight of it, because this was the first blow and it needed to hit without cushioning, and I didn't rush to soften it or explain it away. I wanted them to feel what it meant to realize that the support they bragged about, the help they lorded over me, had been flowing in the opposite direction the entire time, and the silence between us was the first moment in years where I didn't feel small. I felt taller than both of them, not because I wanted power for its own sake, but because the truth has a way of rearranging the ground you're standing on. My mother finally stammered something about misunderstanding, about how I didn't have to dramatize things, about how family is about give and take, and I laughed in a way that surprised even me, because it wasn't bitter or loud. It was the laugh of someone who had been holding a secret so long it turned into a weapon the second it was spoken, and I told her it wasn't dramatics, it was math, cold numbers that had been leaving my account and landing in hers. And if she wanted to call that support, then she should start using the right subject and object, because the only ones who had been supported here were her and my father. The mug in my father's hand tilted slightly, and I watched coffee spill over the rim, not because of clumsiness, but because his grip had loosened, and he muttered my name like he wanted me to take it back. Like I could rewind time and erase what I had just put into the air. But I didn't, because I had nothing left to erase. I had only truth, and when I repeated myself slowly that I had stopped the funding and redirected the money to myself for once, I could see the fear ripple across his face. Not fear of me, but fear of the reality that the safety net he thought was firm had just been cut away. I shut the trunk with a thud that made my mother flinch, and I told them I didn't owe them more explanations, not now and not ever, because explanations had been my currency for too long, and I was done paying in words, just as I was done paying in money. And as I slid into the driver's seat, I left them standing there, staring at each other like strangers, realizing the version of me they had depended on no longer existed, and though they called after me, their voices rising into that shrill register of panic, I drove away without looking back, because the first blow had landed, and I knew deep down that the next ones would make them crumble entirely. The call started before I reached the first stoplight and came in waves the entire morning, my mother leading with the usual mix of confusion and authority as if speaking louder could rewind time. My father following with questions that were really accusations in costume, and my brother chiming in from whatever couch he had found to crash on with a tone that suggested I had just pulled a prank on the whole family. And I let them all roll to voicemail while I drove to a coffee shop, opened my laptop, and began doing what I do best when the noise gets loud, which is make a plan so clear that the facts do the talking and I do not have to. The first part of the plan was housekeeping that should have happened years ago, but guilt had been running the show, so I started by opening the accounts linked to their life and pulling my name, my card, and my money out of every corner where I had tucked it for their convenience, which meant disabling the autopay I had set up for their utilities when my father forgot due dates. Canceling the grocery delivery subscription that my mother loved to pretend was a discount miracle, removing my card from their phone plan where 3 extra lines sat like barnacles, ending the premium memberships they swore made them frugal because they bought in bulk, and closing the gas card I had opened in my name during the winter when my mother was driving my father to appointments and claimed she would pay me back as soon as the snow melted, a season that came and went while the balance sat quietly on my shoulders. While the notifications chimed, I drafted one email that I knew would feel like a slap even though it was nothing more than a list, because there is a special kind of power in putting the truth in bullet points where nobody can pretend they misheard. So I attached screenshots of transfers labeled with dates and purposes. I included the monthly totals for the retirement contributions, the mortgage top-offs, the emergency dental work I covered and later heard them tell friends they had paid for out of pocket, the balance transfer I took on to stop the interest from chewing up their credit, and I wrote, with the calm of a person who no longer owes softness to people who weaponize it, that the faucet had been turned off, that my accounts were no longer available for their use, and that any narrative suggesting they had supported me would need to be retired along with the accounts I had just dismantled. They called again, this time with a thread of panic running beneath the scolding, my mother demanding to know why her pharmacy app was asking for a new payment method. My father snapping that the internet had been cut mid-game and what kind of immature stunt was I pulling, and my brother leaving a message so indignant you would think his name was on the mortgage I had kept above water, and I told each of them, in separate texts because triangulation is their favorite sport, that nothing was broken. Nothing was hacked, and nothing was unclear. It was simply time for adults to handle their own bills, and if they needed help, there are counselors and advisors who take appointments, which, as I reminded my mother with a shade of humor I did not try to hide, is exactly what she used to tell me when I wanted something she did not want to give. What I did next was as petty as it was fair, and I will not apologize for how satisfying it felt, because I gathered the family group chat that has been used for years as a little stage where my mother performs domestic perfection and my father posts pictures of barbecues I paid for, and I dropped a single PDF labeled receipts, inside of which lived the summary sheet from my spreadsheet called What You Called Support, where each line showed a date, a purpose, and an amount, rounded to the dollar and noted with whose problem it solved, and I added one sentence that said, since we are always so proud of transparency and personal responsibility, here is mine, and then I turned off notifications and went for a walk that tasted like oxygen. By the time I came back to my phone, aunts and cousins were chiming in with stunned silence masquerading as little dots that never became words. My brother had shifted tactics from outrage to bargaining with promises of paying me back that sounded as believable as the ones I heard years ago, and my father had gone quiet, which, if you know him, is the only sign that he is actually thinking instead of reacting, while my mother sent 3 messages in a row that said we do not air private matters like this, and then said we are family, and then said you have made your point, and I replied that the point was not made for them, it was made for me, because I needed to hear myself say that I am done. That should have been enough, maybe, if I were only interested in relief, but the thing about finally picking yourself over the story they assigned you is that you start to see the full picture, so I opened the file with my future budget, the one I had been updating in secret at night like a diary, and I redirected the monthly amount that used to leave my account under their names into a fund labeled Start Over. Then I changed the permissions on the shared document where I had tracked their bills so that only I could view it, not because I wanted to gloat, but because the ledger of my labor does not need to sit in their cloud as a monument to how easily they forgot. They tried the last card, which is shame dressed up as concern, warning that ending everything so abruptly would make them look irresponsible to the extended family and to the neighbors who believe every show my mother puts on. And I told them I had not ended everything. I had ended the parts that kept them from reality, and that if they wanted to save face, they could begin by telling the truth about where the help came from and when it stopped, and that I would not argue about tone or timing anymore, because I had spent years turning my voice down and my bank balance out, and that chapter is closed. I will admit something that might split the audience, because as I watched the autopays disappear and the subscriptions blink out like porch lights at bedtime, I felt a thrill I did not try to suppress. A current of satisfaction that was not about cruelty but about clarity, and if that makes me sound cold, then maybe people who never carried a family on a single spine will never understand the heat that floods in when the weight drops. And even as I sat with that feeling, I knew I still had one piece left, the one I had kept quiet about, not out of fear, but because timing matters, and when I deliver it, the story will not merely wobble, it will tip for good. There comes a point in every long game where you stop thinking about whether you are being too harsh or too soft, too direct or too elusive, because once the truth has been cracked open, there is no way to glue it back together. And that is exactly where I found myself the night after I sent the receipts to the family group chat, lying in bed and realizing that everything they had used for years to paint me as the dependent one had already been stripped away. Yet one final piece remained in my back pocket. The one detail they still did not know, the one that would not only flip the story but lock it in place so permanently that no amount of gossip or revision could undo it. When morning came, I did not waste time with small talk or politeness. I drove back to their house, because some things deserve to be said face to face, and when I walked in without knocking, my father was already at the kitchen table staring at a stack of printed bank statements as if rereading them might reveal some hidden loophole, while my mother busied herself with wiping down a counter that did not need cleaning. Her hand moving in frantic circles, her lips tight, and I could see that both of them had been up most of the night, trying to figure out how to turn my revelation into something less devastating, but the tired slump in my father's shoulders told me even he knew the spin was finished. I sat down across from him and said, very evenly, that what they had learned yesterday was only part of the truth, because while I had been funneling money into their accounts, I had also been diverting a portion into a private fund in my own name. A fund that grew steadily with every year they told me I was wasting time. A fund I never mentioned, because I knew the second they discovered it, they would find a way to call it selfish or accuse me of hoarding, and their eyes darted up at me in perfect sync, my father's dark with disbelief, my mother's wide with the dawning recognition that she had never actually controlled me the way she thought she had. I explained, in detail, that the contributions I had pulled from my paychecks were never blind generosity, that I had built a system where their survival depended on my discipline. But my own survival depended on quietly preparing for the day I would stop, and that day had finally arrived, because every cent they once counted on was now locked into a plan that belongs to me and only me. A plan that ensures I will never again sit at a table and be told I am the dependent child, because the numbers no longer lie, the safety net has been redrawn, and it does not include them. My mother tried to argue, her voice breaking on the edges as she said I could not just abandon them after all they had done for me, and I laughed in a way that startled her, not cruelly, but with a clarity that came from years of silence finally breaking. Because I told her she had no idea how much I had already abandoned for them, how many nights I stayed up cutting corners to make sure their bills cleared, how many promotions I passed over because I could not risk the instability of relocation. While they needed me, how many relationships I never pursued because explaining my family's invisible demands was too exhausting, and that if she wanted to tally debts, the column in my favor stretched miles longer than the one in theirs. My father, who has always hated losing, muttered that I had embarrassed them in front of the entire family by sending those receipts, and I told him the embarrassment was not mine to carry. Because the numbers were not lies and the truth does not humiliate unless it reveals something people wanted hidden, and when he said through clenched teeth that they would never forgive me for humiliating them, I leaned forward and said very calmly that forgiveness was not the currency anymore, independence was, and they no longer had the power to grant or withhold anything from me. The silence that followed was heavy, not the silence of a pause, but the silence of realization, and I let it sit there as I gathered my bag and stood, because nothing more needed to be said. The ledger was closed, the balance settled, and their stunned faces were the only confirmation I required. Walking out of that house, I did not feel triumphant in the shallow sense. I felt something deeper, something closer to peace than I had ever tasted, because for the first time in years I was no longer the scaffolding holding up a crumbling story. I was the author of my own, and while I knew they would spend weeks spinning explanations to anyone who would listen, I also knew that every time they sat down to plan their future, they would remember the moment their daughter looked them in the eye and told them she had stopped funding their retirement, and that the ghost they thought they saw in my face was not fear, it was freedom. And so when people ask me what happened after that Sunday dinner, I tell them only this: they said they could not support me forever, but the truth is they never did, and when I finally stopped supporting them, I discovered that the only person I ever needed to answer to was myself, which turned out to be the most epic revenge of all.